Hello everyone, welcome to the last session of Gamification Week for ELBX Online. My name is Andrew Townsend, I'm with eLearning Brothers. Today we're going to be talking about the ROI of gamification. This webinar will be recorded. We will post this on the ELBX Online landing page so you can view that at any time there. If you have questions during the webinar, we'll be ready to answer questions in the questions panel, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. If we can't, we'll try to still get those answered offline. All right, so to talk to us about the ROI of gamification, we have Stephen Baer, Head of Creative at the Game Agency with us today. And I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Stephen.
Super, thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks everybody for joining, appreciate it. Just to introduce myself, as Andrew mentioned, I run creative at the Game Agency, founded the company about 12 years ago, and we focus strictly on building out custom and turnkey game-based solutions, mostly for training and education. I also write a monthly column for Forbes magazine, focused on game solutions. And before this, about 13 years ago, I was director of marketing over at Atari. So I've been in the industry for some time, and I think it's an amazing medium to use, certainly for training purposes. But the question always comes up, well, why should I use it? How much does it cost? And what's the return on my investment? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So for today's discussion, we're going to discuss the benefits of gamified training. We're also going to discuss what that means. So people use gamified or gamification or game-based training. They kind of intersperse those often. So we're going to talk a little about what gamification is and what game-based training is. And there really is a difference. So we'll go through that. We're also going to talk about specifically in the game-based training space, what type of options are there to do? And there's lots. And the last thing is we're going to really cover how do you deliver an ROI based off of using this medium. So we'll get going. One of the things we often hear is just from a training perspective, period, my employees are distracted. They're not stimulated by what I'm training them. They want my feedback. And quite honestly, gamification or game-based training, I should say, can really address a lot of that. Gamified training is much more engaging. It increases as a result the level of attention that you're getting from that learner. It sustains their focus for a much longer period of time. As a result of it being a practice playground, it improves their confidence because they're getting better and better at what you're trying to get them to do. And it drives improvement in their day-to-day function, their performance on the job. So there's a lot of benefits to gamification or game-based training, gamified learning, and we'll go through that in more detail. But as you kind of hear, even I, who've been in this industry forever, and using a lot of those words and interspersing them. So why don't we just step back for a minute and talk a little about what each of those things are. So when you look at gamification, I define it as goals and challenges, progress, points, badges, leaderboards, rewards. These are all individual components that certainly play into what a game is, but they're taking those components and applying it to real world situations. And I'll show you some examples of that. I'm going to compare that to game-based training, and that is create almost a controlled environment and allowing learners to come in, play, test their knowledge, practice their behavior, and improve ultimately to achieve certain goals. And there's lots of examples. I imagine, we've all played games before. There's tons of examples of game-based training solutions out there or training games out there, and I'll show you a number of those to give you a sense of the many things you can do. I'm going to start with gamification. So as I mentioned, gamification has things like progress and points, badges, leaderboards, rewards. What I'm looking at right now is, or what we're looking at right now is a platform that we have called Motivate Cloud over at the Game Agency. Motivate Cloud is a gamified learning management system. So what the heck does that mean? What that means is that it's your traditional LMS, but it has other things involved. It always will show your progress. It will have a number of points. You're going to get points for taking courses, for playing games, for participating in a social feed. It has a leaderboard. So those points are ultimately going to show where you are in comparison to your coworkers. It has badges, certain ones that you can earn. And then once you've earned all that stuff, you can redeem that for tangible rewards. So this is a way of playing off of people's both intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. And ultimately, it's applying it to a real world situation. In this case, the real world situation is we want our trainers to learn. We want them to use our learning management system. We want them to converse with each other. You're giving people motivation to do all those things, and you're getting them to come back over and over and over again. So that's a good example of gamification. Now we're going to jump into games. And games, in my mind, come in all shapes and sizes, but we're going to, for today's purposes, focus on 3. We're going to look at microgames, which are often mobile games. We're going to look at e-learning games, which can be mobile games, but are often PC games or tablet games. And we're going to look at simulation. So, one of the buzzwords today is, I want to do something with augmented reality, with virtual reality. We're going to look at a few of those examples. So microgames. Many of you are familiar either via the game agency or eLearning Brothers. We have a product called the Training Arcade, and I believe actually many of you guys in advance of this webinar played one of the games, the Jump game from the Training Arcade. These are all examples of little micro games. Just going from left to right, Jump is an endless jumper. You're jumping from platform to platform, answering questions along the way. It's really a glorified quiz combined with a really fun game. Then you have Jeopardy. We're all familiar with Jeopardy. We recently came out with this in collaboration with Sony Productions and have the only license of the game out there in the training industry. So super excited about that. You have Scramble, which is a word and sentence scramble game. You have Scenarios, which is going down different branching paths, a choose your own adventure, if you will, right? You have Trivia. You have Sorted, dragging and dropping to the right category, into the right order. You have Recall, watching videos or looking at images and answering questions about them. And you have Match, think Candy Crush, but with questions woven throughout. All these are little micro games. They can take as short as 30 seconds. In most cases, they're average around 3 to 5 minutes. And they can go, a little longer, maybe 10 or 12 minutes, but they're micro ultimately, and they're designed to reinforce the information that you've learned. And we're going to talk about the difference between reinforcing information as well as in compared to having someone learning the information in a game. But they can be done in all sorts of examples, all sorts of environments. Many of them are done as individual study or pre-study or remote study, and you can also use them in an ILT environment. I love about a lot of these games is that they can either be played on their own in a truly competitive nature against other people, or in a collaborative approach where people are working together. So those are micro games. And by the way, certainly during Q&A, I'm happy to answer questions about any of these. So if you have them, please let me know. The next group I'm going to talk about is e-learning games. And so the way I define e-learning games is I think they take the content that you're training and they start to build a storyline, they start to build characters, they start to build scenarios, and it weaves back and forth between learning, trying, and certainly with a more emphasis on trying and seeing the repercussions of what you're doing, and as a result, learning what not to do or what to do more of in the future. So what you're looking at are 2 examples. On the left is an antitrust course. On the right is a risk office manager course, both in the finance industry and both really trying to change behavior through real simulation of experiences. The next examples I'm showing are in the healthcare industry. And what's really nice about, I think, all these examples is that they run the gamut in how they look, right? A game can look any way, shape, or form. The whole idea behind a learning game, though, is to make sure that it feels like someone can get into the content in a meaningful way, can truly engage with it, can be potentially, as is shown on the left-hand side, have an instructor walking you through different things that you need to be cognizant of, and in all cases, give you a place where you can try out those skills and see what works and what doesn't work. Get feedback, get rewards, get incentivized to keep going with it. Okay, the next example I'm going to show you is in the simulation side, and I'm going to switch over to let me just make sure I have this up. So I'm sorry. Okay. So what I love about this is, I'm going to show you a few examples. This is a 3D VR example, right? And it really immerses, because by the way, of WebEx is a little bit choppy, I'm going to just stay on a few frames and show you. But what this is doing is, this is a character. She's walking around, she's talking about what just happened to her. She's talking to the camera, and then we see her in her real life in her own real world environment. And you're immersed in there, and you can certainly explore in there. Next thing we know is this is about identity theft. She's now at the bank. She wants to talk to an advisor. There he is. Let me just pull him up. They sit down and they talk to each other. He helps her walk through different options. And you're hearing her story along the way, but you're immersed in the situation, and you get to choose different ways that she can go down different paths. So that's a much more immersive experience. The next one I'm going to show you, I'm going to use audio for this, is one that I really love. This is an example of having a call center in the background. So the company that made this, Immersion, I love the work that they do. They have a number of predefined avatars, environments, and really knowledgeable call center individuals, if you will, who can sit in a session with the learner. Over here's the learner, and they're going to listen to what he's saying. They're going to ask him probing questions. They're going to have a conversation. They're going to push back. And what's really neat about this is, honestly, it's role playing, but it's taking you maybe off your guard a little bit because you're doing it in a virtual world. It's honestly actually a little weird at first, but once you engage in it, you kind of within about 30 seconds forget about that. So I'm going to just play this for a second.
So the first thing I want to ask you to think about is your approach in that situation. I understand being upset when you've got a client with a need and you want to get that resolved. That's number one priority. That's what we're here for.
Okay, but can I just point out, I think this is kind of sexist, frankly. I have the same leadership style as Jack over in advertising, and no one is talking to him about changing his leadership style, which I think is part of what you're going to be doing here.
Well, first off, Jack,
I need assurances that.
Now, Stephen, these are going to be difficult to hear. What I'm going to do is I will paste a link to this YouTube video in the chat. So if you guys want to watch these on your own, you can. I'll post that right here in the chat.
That's perfect. Thanks, Andrew. I appreciate it. So
Yep.
I encourage you to look at these because both of these are really nice examples of taking it to a whole nother level. Really, whether you're doing 360 video or you're doing immersive conversations that get down to the nuances of your body language in the training process, your tone of voice. In certainly in the case of this, which is built by Immersion, they're able to really weigh in on the individual learner and help them think through how they're coming across. It's beautiful stuff. So why am I showing all this to you? I'm showing you all this because what all these examples are doing and doing really successfully is they're changing the way that that we're learning. Right, so if you look at this chart, it's a very simple chart, but the traditional e-learning method has us absorbing information, often based off of passive training, and then just maybe applying those skills a little here by there, maybe a little quiz, maybe a little bit of on the job. What this is doing is it's almost turning that model on its head. Right, this is about applying skills in a virtual world, getting someone to actually really engage with your content in a safe environment and fail if they need to, because better for them to fail in that virtual world and then hear what they're doing and then try again and hear what they're doing, than to get some information, often in a passive learning training approach, and try to apply it in the real world and quite honestly get distracted by everything else that's happening and not being able to remember what they even learned. So a few thoughts here. With traditional training, we have a few goals here. We want to engage. We want certainly people to be proficient. We want them to be confident. We want them to be able to apply that, those skill sets or knowledge in the real world, and we want them to be able to retain it. And honestly, study after study show that traditional methods are low to moderate in their success in accomplishing those things. But when you start to take game-based training, it is way more immersive, right? The level of competition, the level of challenge, the recognition, the rewards, that's going to bring somebody in and engage them on a much deeper level. Certainly the proficiency, you're going to start them off simple if you design it well, and you're going to reiterate, have them try different things, and until they've done so, they won't really be masters, but they're going to master it much deeper than they would in a passive learning experience. So great, so now we've obtained proficiency. The other thing is that you're giving them time to practice. You're giving them time to succeed, and in doing so, you're giving them a level of confidence that they wouldn't get by just hearing what you're training them on, and not necessarily being able to roll their sleeves and try it. Certainly also the application of that. The reality is that they're applying it in a virtual world on a much deeper level than they would in traditional training. So they're able to apply it in the real world much more successfully because they've had a few practice rounds in a virtual experience. And finally, once again, you want to have them retain this. And there are no better way to retain something than to have someone experience it. They say that that the people who are most knowledgeable are the ones who can actually teach it themselves. And you can't teach it until you can do it. So the whole thing about getting someone to try over and over and over again until that they are the masters of that content, and ultimately are able to retain that information. So along these lines, we want to motivate. We want people to practice. We want certainly the people to get feedback, and we want to make sure that they're able to retrieve that. And once again, having goals, having challenges, having conflict, cooperation, points, badges, rankings, rewards, that's going to accomplish those first three buckets. And be able to retrieve, one of the things that they always talk about in driving memory is stories and emotions and attachment to a particular information. And there's no better way to build that story arc and that connection with the content than having someone engage with it in a game format. Once again, it's a clear differentiation between a passive learning experience, which can be accomplished in the form of written or images or video, and an active learning experience where you're requiring that person to dig in and really engage with the content. So a few more slides here. Games ultimately, I believe, drive many things. The first one I would say is higher order thinking skills. Being able to think through things strategically, being able to analyze information, be able to formulate plans, and be able to adapt. Games change just like real world does. So giving people that virtual world where they can try out those skills, adapt based off of what they're seeing, and adapt again based off of the feedback they're getting is critical. The other thing that they offer certainly that is incredibly meaningful and beneficial is soft skills. Learners really can grow their emotional intelligence, really understanding other characters, story arcs, situations. They can drive better communications. They certainly learn how to problem solve and navigate certain situations. And they learn how to not only do it on their own, but how to collaborate. And in a well-designed game, you're going to be collaborating with other characters to really succeed in any situation. We recently did a study of 1,000 games that were created in the training arcade. That was a first group of microgames that I showed you. A few things to note. On the low end, a micro experience can be as short as 3, 5, 10 minutes. We saw that the average person plays those games for about 6 minutes. We also saw that the average person comes back to play them 2.9 times in total. And why that's meaningful is I think that most of us would say the average learner, they come, they learn, and they don't say, gosh, I really would love to read that PowerPoint again, or I really would love to hear that lecture again. So people on their own accord are coming back, and that's meaningful because it means that they're finding connection with these games. Probably most important though is we're seeing a measurable improvement in knowledge. In just that first 6 minutes, we're seeing a 64% lift in knowledge of the content. And that's based off the way that we're designing the content, reintroducing it if someone doesn't get it in a timely manner, and making sure that it's reemphasized and that they are masters of it. There's all sorts of data that you can track, and this gets certainly into the ROI. It's great to know that my employee had fun. It's great to know that they were engaged. but what do they actually know and how do they behave, and how do I use that data in a meaningful way to make sure that my investment was well worth it. So you can certainly look at the number of users, the scores, the rankings, the sessions, the number of sessions, the duration of sessions. You can get down to knowledge. What do people know? What don't they know? But you can also look at behavioral trends, and this is something that we're focused on a lot over at the game agency. It's not just looking at what people know, but what does that data tell us? Probably more importantly, what behaviors are they showcasing? Great example is the scenarios game, where you're starting to see them go down different paths. You're seeing how they're engaging with different characters, how they're approaching different situations. These are all really critical skills to be able to analyze, because the more you know about that person, the more you're gonna be able to identify, A, where do they need additional improvements, and B, where can you utilize them most effectively in your organization. There is no other form of training besides game-based training that's going to allow you to do that. I always look at Candy Crush as an example of a great data story. Candy Crush drives nearly $600,000 in revenue every day, and that's because they're looking at their game, they're looking at their players, they're looking at their performance, and they're tweaking on a regular basis. And while none of us, well, the exception of me on this call, are probably game designers on our day-to-day basis, we all have the opportunity to build games and hone in on making them a little bit better, more effective, to ultimately make sure that our employees are effective. I think this is a tool that not only is a great one for delivering information, helping people try things out, but quite honestly is as close as you can get to a revenue stream, because the more effective you can make your employees in this environment, the more effective they're going to be for the company, and productive, and ultimately profitable for the organization. So a few quick takeaways. Why training games are effective and what the ROI is. They make people more engaged. They increase attention. They sustain focus. They improve confidence. And they certainly drive much higher performance. And as a buyer, certainly I think that those are all critical things that I want in my organization. And certainly as a trainer, it's something that I want to make sure that I am including in my training, because ultimately it's going to make it a lot more sticky and a lot more effective in the long run. So that's my 30-cent tour. I really appreciate your time. Happy to answer any questions. And hopefully that was a helpful set of slides.
Yeah, there's several questions here that go back over the course of the presentation. When it comes to building games, what tools and resources do you suggest? This person is using Storyline, but would be interested in any other tools.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it definitely comes down to what your objective is, right? I will say that in many ways, while I love a deep game and a deep simulation, in many ways it's not necessary. And certainly if you're using Storyline, my guess is that you're weaving it in and out of some of your training you're doing. So one of the things that the game agency launched about 2 years ago, and I'm just going to pull up, sorry, 1 second, pull up a website for it. We launched the Training Arcade a few years ago, and we've collaborated with eLearning Brothers on it since day one. What I love about this tool, and I'll just log in real quick, is that in 15 to 30 minutes, you can create a game. And so if you're building games right now in Storyline, my guess is that that's taking not just hours, it's taking days or weeks. They say the average game built in Storyline takes about 90 hours. With the Training Arcade, you can quickly decide what game you want to do. You can determine, so I just picked the jump game that I showed you earlier. You can determine what language, it's available in 15 languages. You can determine the quick things like how much time do you want to give people per question, what percentage to complete. Do you want to randomize questions? Do you want to turn on tutorials? Do you want to drive them to more information afterwards? Do you want to have a pop-up information to set the context? You want to turn the leaderboard on? What do you want it to look like? And have a whole bunch of preset templates that you can choose from. And what do you want your splash screen to be? And then you can literally just start adding questions. And what's really nice about that is you can add all sorts of media, images, audio, video. You can do 5 question types, multiple choice, multi-select, image match, text input, polling. You can quickly determine how many answers you want to give, what's correct and what's incorrect, and then what feedback loop you want to do. And so that jump game that most of you played before, that probably took about 15 minutes to build. And that is really hard to beat. So that's the tool that I certainly talk about the most. We've put the last several years into building it out. There's now several hundred companies on the platform, and it solves a lot of issues from time, cost, and certain level of engagement.
Excellent. There's a couple of questions about the VR demonstrations you showed. Is it easy to track the triggers and hotspots in LMSs using those?
So not in LMSs. So one of the things, and this is actually something we're doing right now for a handful of clients, is we're tying that. I'm going to jump back into here. We're tying that data back to. Let me just get a better example. Sorry, 1 second. So yeah, we're tying that data back into our dashboard. So, and there's other homegrown solutions like this. But the reality is that if you're using XAPI, yes, you can push it right into your LMS. But I'd say about 1% of the market is using XAPI today. If you're using SCORM, it's pretty minimal in the data that you're collecting. So you're going to want to track it in another environment. So we're building a lot of our VR solutions and then plugging the data into our user dashboard and looking at not only what people know, where people are going, what the behavioral trends are, and tracking all of that right here. So you can certainly do a mix of the two. The nice thing is you can deploy that type of solution in your LMS as a SCORM wrapped game. You can track certainly the basic data there, and you can track more here.
Another question about the VR or the immersion example that you showed. Was the employee on the right in the small window, was that a recording of the person actually going through the training, or were those both part of the course?
Oh yeah, great question, and sorry that wasn't clear. The small box on the top right-hand corner, that was a person going through the training real time. And the bigger box, which was the illustrated version or animated version, was the game environment. But what you don't see is on the back end of that, that individual is basically doing a call with a call-in center. The call-in center has scripts to go through, but more importantly, is well versed enough on the topic to know that here are some of the hot buttons you need to push back on any employee on when they're going down a different direction. And so, as you saw, like one great example on there was she, the virtual character, was listening to what that employee was saying, and she pushed back on him, basically saying, you know what, no, what you're saying is sexist, and I want to talk about that. And that's obviously something that is a great example of role play. It certainly drives him to have a conversation with her about it, or cut it off as he did. But it also takes the pressure away a little bit, because you're not standing, face to face with somebody. You're playing with a virtual environment, character in a virtual environment.
A question here about the training arcade, and you've got it there up on the screen. You explained that it was very easy to create a game with the training arcade, but how does that fit into a learning module?
Oh, it's a great question. So you have a few options. If let's say that you're building your course out in Articulate or Captivate or Lector or whatever, you can build a game or several games within the training arcade and embed them into those files as web objects. So that's really easy, and we see that often, and this goes back to the kind of that chart that I showed, which was gameplay training. We encourage people to use gameplay in a meaningful way and sprinkle it throughout, as opposed to just an assessment tool at the very end. Honestly, we don't think that's a very effective way of using games. So you want to have have practice throughout your training. But technically, all you need to do is put it in as a web object, and it will be included in your training material. Alternatively, if you don't want to use it in collaboration with a rapid authoring tool, you can publish it out with a SCORM wrapper, and you can just upload it right into your LMS as its own form of training. The reality is I look at those 8 games, and while some of them can certainly be good pre or post assessments, if you will, and as a result, you'd want to do a wrapper. The only ones that I think really belong on their own are the scenarios games. They're much deeper in nature, and you can take them in many, many different directions and really have someone spend not the 6 minutes on average that I mentioned earlier, but 20, 30, 40 minutes really going down paths of different characters, trying out different things. And in that regard, it doesn't really need to plug into training. It can be its own module, if you will.
Excellent. And then here's a great question, especially considering what this session is on. How would you best present the ROI for games to stakeholders? If you're trying to sell them on games, what is the best way to show ROI?
Yeah, so I go back to these points here. Quite honestly, there is no form of training that's more engaging than games. The reality is, I look at everything else out there, and whether it is instructor-led, really talking, whether it's video, whether it is PowerPoint, whether it's otherwise, those are all passive learning experiences. So you're really bringing the person in to the content. I always use this as an example. In most states, there's a law of no texting and driving, and yet I think that there's so many people out there who are guilty of doing just that. But I can't imagine there are many people who are on this call, if anybody, who would raise their hand and say that they play games while they're driving. It is that immersive of a media that you can't really multitask while you're playing a game. And as a result, it's increasing the level of attention, the focus of your employees. And because it's that much of an immersive playground around your training content, you're driving much better performance, much better confidence, and application on the job. So I talk about all that, and there's lots of studies we have that show that, and certainly even the little ones that I showed earlier, showing that 64% lift in knowledge. We have other ones that talk about lift and retention. But in my mind, it comes down to the 5 bullets that I have on the screen here.
Excellent. Do you find people of all generations enjoy games? Is it a universal thing?
No, it's a great question. When we started this company 12 years ago, I remember, and by the way, when we started the company 12 years ago, there was no iPhone App Store. At the time, some of the social games that ultimately became really popular on Facebook and whatnot didn't exist, obviously. And what I found was, is as mobile and social games became more and more popular, gaming over the last certainly more than a decade has gone from what was considered, God, my kid who's in high school, who's in the basement playing games, to most of us walking around with our phones pulled out, playing a game, whether it is on a commute or after a long day or just taking a break, and sometimes playing by ourselves, sometimes playing with our kids. It really does cross generations, it cross genders, and it's about identifying the right game for the right audience and for the right topic. But I don't think that I would point to any generation and say they don't play.
For those of us that are brave enough to develop our own games, is there a specific tool that you find is best for creating these types of games? I will say that we at eLearning Brothers have created games in Lectora, Storyline, and Captivate. Yesterday we did a session of an advanced game that was created in Storyline by Bill Milstead, our lead developer. So you can definitely create games, solid games, in Lectora and Captivate and Storyline, but what other tools are there if people want to try to develop on their own?
Yeah, so a few things. As I mentioned earlier, all those rapid authoring tools have good options. The irony is that I wouldn't call any of those options rapid, right? The average game that is going to be built that's a really good game using those platforms is going to take about 90 hours. So if you have that amount of time to devote, those are all great tools. You know, even better, certainly, we're big fans over here at the game agency of Unity. You know, we like to do, we've built many 3D environments, modeled characters, and much deeper simulations. But you need to have development chops. And so if you or someone on your team does, I love Unity. I think it is phenomenal. We've also recently been using the Unreal Engine. And that really, those are for much deeper 3D, story-driven, immersive simulations. If you're looking to get your feet wet, it's one of the reasons I talk about the training arcade is it doesn't require coding. It's about drop downs, uploads, typing in things, and you can build something yourself. See if it works. Certainly costs a lot less than any of those are going to, both from a time perspective as well as a cost perspective and a resource perspective. And you can test out games. And I think that and you can test out a number of different types of games. So I guess that's my answer, Andrew.
You mentioned all these different tools like Unity, Unreal Engine. Do you use 3ds or Maya to create assets?
Yeah. So we use both. We also often will buy assets from Turbo Squid or other repositories where you can buy 3D stuff. We have, you know, just a little background on the game agency. We're about 40 people and have about 10 artists on staff, constantly working on both 2D and 3D initiatives. And so we have the benefit of being able to quickly either create or alter art. If you have that ability, fantastic. If you don't, there's some great assets out there that you can buy that are pre-built. And once again, I mentioned Turbo Squid is a great place to buy those. We also, here's another example. This is a project we're actually just starting to work on with Elearning Brothers, is in collaboration with a major hospital that is moving locations, and we're working with their architecture firm and taking a lot of their files and basically importing them right into a Unity engine and building out a game with that, and then adding some textures onto them, adding in objects, adding in characters. So sometimes you don't even have to start from scratch. You can certainly leverage other material that's out there.
Awesome. I'm going to ask you one more question, but I'm going to take the screen back so that we can have this other information up while we are talking. This last question is, do you have any book suggestions for theory about how to create even micro e-learning or any sort of games?
Yeah, so there's a few things I like. Carl Kopp has done some really interesting things on gamification, and in those books he's certainly talked about some best practices out there. Michael Allen has also covered some information on game-based training and theory. Also, I'd encourage you guys. I've done a number of articles. I have probably about 24 articles on Forbes that I've written on that Forbes.com on the topic. So please check those out. This might be helpful and certainly quick and digestible. So
excellent. All right, so this concludes the gamification week of ELBX Online. We've still got 3 more weeks to go. Next week, we're going to be talking about mobile, so you'll want to jump on that and learn all about that. That will go all the way through April 5th. We'll continue ELBX Online through April 5th. Early bird pricing for ELBX Live will be available all the way through April 5th as well. Right now, it's $199 to get to ELBX Live, and that price is going to jump up after ELBX Online ends. If you guys want to try some of the games that the eLearning Brothers asset library has, including Evelyn's Quest that we showed off yesterday, you can grab those in a free trial. If you register for a free trial, go to elearningbrothers.com, and in the top right hand corner there's a free trial section, Or if you want to know exactly what you can grab with that free trial, you can give us a call, 801-796-2767, or email us at info@elearningbrothers.com. Also, we'd be happy to show you more of the training arcade. That's always a really, really cool tool that we love. We think it's really fun. So if you want to take a look at that, you can also give us a call and we'll be happy to give you a tour of that. Thanks, Stephen. This has been super useful. Thanks, everybody, for joining us for ELBX Online, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks very much, everyone.